Welcome. Thank you for being here. At this time, we'll call to order the Yamhill County Board of Commissioners formal session for September 13th, 2018, and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. McKaylee, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next is public comment. So if you're here to make public comment, it's a 30-minute time period set aside for anything other than land use. I think anyone has an intention to speak on just general issues. So if that's the case, we'll move on to the consent agenda, which is item B. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have a motion to approve the consent agenda. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion passes. On to C, old business, we have none. D, no other business. At this point, we'll open up a public hearing for receipt of public comment on the approval of the issuance of revenue refinancing bonds by the National Finance Authority for the benefit of Waste Management, Inc., provided Yamhill County shall not act as the issuer of the bonds, nor shall have any legal liability with respect to the bonds. So do we have anyone who'd like to make a comment?
Oh. Madam Chair, we have a representative from NFA here to provide us a little more information.
Okay, thank you, sir. If you'd give us your name and address for the record, please.
Good morning. My name is Ben Barker. I'm with the National Finance Authority. We're here this morning for a public hearing, or a TEFRA hearing, and this is in regards to the 2007 bonds that were issued. This is part of a larger multi-jurisdictional national issuance, and so there's three other states that are involved, and so we're just simply refunding the bonds that were done in 2007. The NFA will be issuing a new set of bonds with new maturity, and nothing new is happening with the project. It's just a straight refunding of the old debt.
So that was the originally, what was that, 25 years ago? 2007? Was that
refunding of it?
Yeah,
That was the, okay. All right, well, thank you. Any questions, commissioners? All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Do we have anyone who would like to comment on the approval of the issuance of refinancing these bonds? Okay. Well, then I will close that and ask for a motion to approve the issuance of the bonds.
Yes.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion, since this is only for the refinancing of the bonds, that we go ahead as the governing jurisdiction in this sale, authorize the reissuing of the bonds, refi of the bonds.
Okay, we have a motion to approve. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. The motion passes unanimously. At this time, I will open a public hearing for docket C-08-18 SDR-12-18, which is an appeal of the Planning Director's approval of a conditional use and site design review for a commercial solar power generation facility consisting of approximately 8 acres. The applicant is Black Forest Solar LLC, and the appellant is Jeff Stilling. So at this time, any abstentions or objection to jurisdiction?
Madam Chair, I'd like to just go on record of knowing that I do know one of the original applicants and owners of the property, but it shouldn't affect my ability to make a decision in the matter.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. And
I would make the same acknowledgement as Commissioner Olson, but I still believe I am capable of rendering a fair and just verdict.
And Counselor, for the reading of the statement required by ORS 197-7635.
Did you ask for, okay, sorry, there were no site visits then?
No.
Oregon law requires that persons who attend a land use hearing be advised of certain rights and duties before the hearing begins. First, with regard to the standards for approval, state law, ORS 197-7635, requires that we list the applicable substantive criteria that must be met in order for the county to approve the application. The applicable standards will be listed by Stephanie, the county planner, in a moment as part of the staff report. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward the standards for approval. Second, the raise it or waive it rule. Under Oregon law, any issue that might be raised in an appeal of the county's decision in this matter must be raised before the record of this hearing is closed. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision makers and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the board based on that issue. Third, and this is directed to the applicant, under ORS 197796, failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval, again with sufficient specificity to allow the county to respond to the issue, precludes an action for damages in circuit court. And finally, I will also note that under Oregon law, and because this is the initial evidentiary hearing on this matter, any participant that is anyone who submits oral or written testimony during this hearing may, before the record is closed, request an opportunity to present additional evidence, argument, or testimony regarding the application. The request must be made prior to the time the chair announces that the hearing is closed. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sadlow. So at this time, we will move on to our staff report. Ms. Armstrong?
The tract is approximately 173 acres and is dedicated to commercial agricultural uses, including hay and grass seed production, fruit and hazelnut orchards, and vineyards. There are 2 dwellings on the property as well as a number of other farm buildings. The applicant intends to use 8 acres near the center of the tract for the commercial solar power generating facility. According to the application, the facility will consist of solar arrays on a fixed tilt racking system with inverters, a transformer pad, perimeter fencing, access driveways, and connections to the existing power lines. An existing private driveway and internal farm roads are proposed to provide direct access to Southeast Lafayette Highway. All of the surrounding parcels are zoned for exclusive farm use. Parcels to the east are zoned EF80, to the north and west EF40, and to the south EF20. The area is a mixture of farm uses, forested areas, as well as single-family homes. The application needs to satisfy sections 402.04M, 402.07A and D, 1101.02, and 1202.02 of the Yamhill County zoning ordinance. Comprehensive plan policies are also applicable, and the agricultural lands rules under OAR 660-033-0130 sub 38. And that concludes the staff report.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the proponent's case, and we'll start with Connor Grogan. And Connor, if you could state your name and your address for the record, please.
Good morning. My name is Connor Grogan. My address is 1720 Southwest 4th Avenue, Portland, Oregon, 97201.
Thank you.
I don't have it installed on mine. I'll call IT.
I'm wondering if it'd be a good idea if there's a proponent who doesn't need to use the PowerPoint. Oh, Laura to the rescue.
Thank you. I think File Explorer, yeah. If you click that, yeah. Then here. Sorry, the one above. Maybe in view. Let's scroll out. Great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Sorry, Mr. Grogan. Thank you for your patience.
No problem. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Conor Grogan, and I'm representing Solis Solar, the applicant for this project. So, what I'll speak about in my testimony, I'll introduce my company, what we do, how we identify sites, briefly the benefits of solar. I will introduce this specific project and give a summary of our conditional use permit application submission. I will just summarize our response to the appeal as well, and then a quick conclusion. So, Solis Solar, we are a solar development company. We were incorporated in Portland in 2016. Prior to that, we were operating in the UK, where we were developing solar and battery storage sites for 5 years. So that's where we developed our experience in the solar development industry. Just in case people are wondering as to where our name comes from, Solis is the pronunciation of light in Irish, which is, if people haven't guessed from my accent, is where I'm from and my fellow director. So, kind of how we identify sites, just to give people a background as to what we look for initially. So, in order to export the electricity generated from a solar site, proximity to three-phase distribution is a key criteria, and that is the first thing that we look for. That grid export capacity needs to be of sufficient quality in order to be able to take the amount of generation exported onto the local infrastructure. Then we look for an amenable landowner. Obviously, we need landowners to find sites, and then we assess each of our sites for suitability with regards to permitting. The criteria that we look for is a lack of wetlands, floodplains, or wildlife issues, independent access to the project area, that it can adhere to county and state codes for photovoltaic projects, and that the introduction of the project will not negatively impact surrounding land uses. So really briefly, the benefits of solar. There's approximately 40 jobs during the 10 to 12 week construction period. This project will generate a higher property tax, which amounts to about $10,000 per annum. It increases local energy security by reducing dependency on kind of traditional further away fossil fuel generators. With regards to the landowner and all of our landowners, the lease payments do assist with financing other farming activities and on other part of the property. And in general, as a development, they're quiet, they're low in height, and pretty passive projects with regards to noise and emissions and smells. So an introduction to this specific project then. It's approximately 4 miles east of Amity and is accessed via the Southeast Lafayette Highway. The suitability criteria that I spoke about earlier, we thought applied here when we were looking at the site originally. It has a low visual impact, as the planner noted in his report. The nearest off-site residence is over 500 feet away. It has current independent access from Lafayette Highway. It is close to the PGE grid infrastructure that I spoke about earlier. It will not negatively impact surrounding uses. I'll speak about that a little bit more later. And on where the site will be located, there are no wetlands, floodplains, or wildlife issues. So for the next few slides, I'll give a kind of summary of our application that we submitted back in February, I believe. So one of the big criteria in the OARs is that you can demonstrate that when you're introducing the solar facility, it is only taking a maximum of 12 acres from productive farmland. So it's not fragmenting a bigger parcel that would make it more difficult to access or increase the cost. So we spend a lot of time in our application in addressing that piece. How we did that is we did an inventory, which you can hopefully see around the subject area. It was an inventory for 1,200 feet surrounding the site or surrounding the project area. It covered a total of 16 parcels and 300 acres. What we did is we reviewed the current farming practices for each of those 16 parcels. This included identification of the current crop, when the current crop was planted, what machinery, if there is machinery required to farm and harvest the crop, how each of the parcels are accessed, and when the typical harvest is for each of the parcels. And from that, we concluded that each parcel can still be farmed and accessed like before, and thus no change to the current cost and practices of the surrounding farmland. Also, the landowner does own all of the land directly surrounding the project area, and has attested to being comfortable with those areas still remaining in farmland. So another big piece of our application was our soil erosion and compaction plan, which we got a qualified and experienced permitting consultant to undertake. It details the soil erosion and compaction best management practices that we will implement throughout construction. I'd also point out that Yamhill, the planning department, have imposed a condition upon us that does restrict construction during the winter months, which I believe was to counteract some of the previous issues with solar farms that made a lot of soil compaction, you could say. So it also lists the remedies that will be implemented should soil compaction occur. They include ploughing, subsoiling techniques, and replanting with deep-rooted vegetation. A second report we did is the weed control report. Again, I highlight this because it was brought up as an issue on previous solar sites. The same ecologist, qualified consultant, provided this weed control report for us. They're based in Portland, have over 12 years of experience both in the state and throughout the country. This report identifies the possible weed species that are known to occur, according to Yamhill and Oregon weed lists, and it also it lists the components that are required for weed management. Again, it's best management practices throughout construction, post-construction restoration, and then during the operation of the site, how those weeds will be controlled, and it's the focus of this weed control plan was to restrict herbicide drift. So it's a licensed individual spot applying herbicide. It's hand mowing and grazing. And so that's what the weed control report demonstrates. Some of the other reports and documents that we submitted as part of our application was a national wetlands inventory map, a floodplain map. We were required, because there is a wetland on the property, not within the site, but on the property, to do a stormwater impact report, which we got a qualified engineering firm to carry out. We did a agricultural pest plan. We did a site-specific noise report as well, which was carried out by a noise engineering firm who used software to simulate the noise that the inverters on site will make, and show that it does that the noise felt at or heard outside the property will be below ambient noise levels and the county required codes. Also, we submitted an NRCS, or a National Resources Conservation Service soil map, and we submitted a map showing surrounding solar sites, both under approval and under review or approved, showing that we adhere to the state OAR code of a maximum of 48 acres of solar projects within 1 mile radius. So I'll address some of the opponents' appeal for the next few minutes and 2 slides. We believe that it. I firmly believe that it is the OAR codes for photovoltaic solar that did apply when we first applied, and therefore are relevant for this project. We have adhered to all of those codes, and the planners have confirmed that in their report. We also think that we're consistent with the Yamhill County Comprehensive Plan, which the opponents disagreed with. Some of the items that I'd like to point out is that the existing, so there's cherry trees on the site, and the landowner will describe this in greater detail later on, but they have reached the end of their 30-year production cycle and are no longer productive. The topography of the site makes mechanical harvest very difficult, and future crops would be difficult to farm. I mentioned earlier about no fragmentation of farmland. So this is a very individually accessed site. It doesn't stop farming from happening on the surrounding areas. There's no wetlands or other natural resources on site. The comprehensive plan does refer to its environmental goals and increasing renewable energy where possible, which obviously this assists with. And then onto the conditional use and site design criteria. Although visual impact isn't necessarily called out in the OARs, I think keeping within the character of the surrounding area we think that it is a very appropriate site in this regard. It's difficult to see from Lafayette Highway. As I mentioned earlier, it's more than 500 feet from the nearest off-site residence, and between that is circa 400 feet of Douglas fir trees. And as I said earlier, the comprehensive inventory of parcels within 1,200 feet show that there is no increased cost or forced change to farming practices. So just to wrap it up, we firmly believe that we have chosen an appropriate site here. The planning department have confirmed that it met all of the relevant criteria at both county and state level for a photovoltaic solar project. Also in doing so, they've confirmed that we submitted a complete application. I just in response to some of the opposition that's come in, I think that it can kind of be put into two definite categories. There's the anti-solar arguments, which there have been a lot of, and there's the arguments against this site in particular, and the former heavily outweighs the site-specific arguments. A lot of arguments which we've all heard before about solar on high-value farmland were made. Whether unfounded or not, the board has decided to amend the code to prohibit solar from being installed on high-value farmland from now on. So I think a lot of the arguments against solar have been made, and the board have decided to take those, into effect, and therefore aren't really relevant for this project. The proliferation of solar throughout the county shouldn't be of concern anymore. And then, with regards to the site-specific arguments that were made, so the main opponent argued that it will be of visual impact from a future winery that he is intending to develop. I think, with all due respect to the opponent, arguing using a future development is questionable. I think that the opponent might have seen some of the decisions before made in this room, specifically between Atticus Winery and Yamhill Creek Solar Farm, and used the kind of winery versus solar decisions and concerns that were brought up there, and have kind of placed them upon this project for a future winery, which isn't in effect at the moment. So I'd ask the board to take that into account. That's it from me. I'll ask I'm happy to take questions, but then I'll ask the landowner to make a brief testimonial also.
Commissioners, questions?
No questions.
I just had one on one of your initial statements about proximity to three-phase distribution being a criteria in site selection. And there has been a lot of pushback on solar arrays, especially on high-value farmland. And we have so much land in the state of Oregon that is not developable and certainly not high value. And yet you put money into developing these on this high value soil. Why not invest some of that money developing these grids in areas that would better accommodate these types of facilities?
So are you suggesting that we build electrical infrastructure to places that would be more appropriate?
That would be, to me, make a lot more sense than going through this process each time you're trying to expand into areas that obviously are not welcoming to this particular type of project. If that money were being spent to develop areas that would accommodate this very nicely, and I'm referencing Eastern Oregon, for instance.
Sure.
You could drive for miles and not, but it's just a question I had on why developers aren't spending money developing these grids, that's all.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, and it is something that we've looked into, considerably. The rules as they were allowed us to develop up to 20 acres on arable, on farmland considered arable. So it is in our interest to develop larger sites. It would cost us the same amount to develop a 20-acre site as it would a 12. So, throughout we primarily operate in the Portland General Electric area. So we work in Clackamas, Yamhill, Marion, Washington, Polk, and so we, arguably the low-hanging fruit for a solar developer would be to develop on arable farmland. So one of the first things that we did when we were looking into this 2 years ago is that we got we downloaded all of the soil quality databases, and we categorized them into high-value arable and non-arable farmland. We mapped them on geospatial information software. We mapped the three-phase distribution. We drew a corridor around the three-phase distribution and identified all of the arable farmland that is within those corridors. And it is minuscule. It is genuinely minuscule. You can't even see it on a map if I put it up on the screen. It's just not there. The reason for that is that three-phase electricity is where is good quality kind of electricity infrastructure. Good quality infrastructure is put where people are, and people are generally where high-value farmland is. So the grid quality lessens the less amount of people there are. So kind of towards the Cascades or towards the Tillamook Mountains, the grid infrastructure weakens because there's less people that need it there. So unfortunately, energy facilities need high-quality electrical infrastructure. That is where people are, and people are where high-value farmland is. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation within the Willamette Valley. I take your point on east of the Cascades. We've looked at doing that ourselves. As you said, it would be a lot easier. I'd prefer to do a 300-acre solar farm, instead of lots of 12-acre ones. But the grid infrastructure just isn't in place there at the moment. So we would, we have reports that show the feasibility of some of our investigations east of the Cascades, and it would cost us multi-million grid infrastructure in order to transport that electricity to where it is actually needed. So, some sites are doing that east of the Cascades, but it's very, it's the cost of doing so is very prohibitive. So, I acknowledge that high-value farmland isn't the best place to put solar facilities. My family in Ireland we are from a farming background, so I do acknowledge and appreciate all of the arguments that are made, in the Willamette Valley. But unfortunately, my solar hat at the moment is more predominant, and we want to develop solar here. PG needs renewable energy integration in order to get to their renewable portfolio standards that they're obligated to under the Oregon and federal law, and they incentivize us to do so. So that's that's my answer.
Thank you.
Any
Appreciate
other
the
questions?
information.
Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Corrigan, thank you very much. So at this point, Mr. Les Stevens?
That would be me.
Sir, if you could state your name and address for the record, please.
My name's Les Stevens. I am the property owner. I have a short statement, and it starts this way. Good morning, my name's Les Stevens, and I'm the owner of Shadow Hill Farms, LLC. I currently share management of the property with my wife and son-in-law. The farm was purchased by Aaron Stevens in December 1865 and has been family-owned and operated for almost 153 years. We have managed and maintained it with an eye for the future, and to date have been successful in those efforts. To that end, we concluded in 2016 that we should pursue the option of placing solar on an area of the farm. We currently have cherries, plums, grapes, hazelnuts on the farm. Presently, there are 2 large grass fields that are leased out. We will be planting them to hazelnuts, plums, and cherries over the next 3 years. This long-term plan requires substantial investment and requires strict analysis as to the profitability of each enterprise. We will see full production of those plantings in 2025. So we're looking at long-term investments currently. The particular area that we selected for a solar project has been a cherry orchard for over 30 years. Normal production cycles in cherries is about 25 years. The current orchard is showing signs of age, and production is no longer a profitable venture. Some of the trees are too large for our machines to harvest. Yields have decreased over the past 5 years to below 2.5 tons per acre. Input costs such as fertilizer, herbicide, and insecticide spray remain the same. Pruning labor and hedging have increased in cost. We have purchased new harvesting equipment. Our older machines were on 4 wheels and very stable. The newer machines are a tricycle configuration and less stable. We have concluded that replanting on the current spot would create a more dangerous situation for ourselves and our employees. We plan to maintain the orchard below the one to be removed for the solar project because it has considerably less pitch. We have approached several wineries in the area with an option of leasing this steep area for wine grapes. We currently have 4.5 acres available, but over the past 5 years have not had any success in finding a winery to lease the ground. The factors in this situation revolve around high wine volume, production for the past few years, and an increase in fruit being harvested per acre. In the past, it was common for wineries to request fruit sets of 1.5 to 2 tons per acre. Today, it is more common to see fruit sets up to 2.5 to 3 tons on Pinot Noir. This means that there's a lot more fruit available at current vineyards and less interested in leasing and investing in new acreage. We see planting grapes without a secure market as an extremely risky proposition.
$250,000 probably to plant grapes in that area as an initial investment with no promise of sales. So our next option is to plant the parcel back to fir trees. We selected the site for a solar project because it faced dense forests and would not be visible from the highway. Subject to our contract negotiations and signing, a block of ground a half-mile away was purchased. The new owners tore down one of the homes on the property and cut down all the timber. Currently, this area may be subject to considerable erosion over the winter since it's now bare of vegetation. We have been informed that this is the area where the new owners plan to build a house and believe that our solar project will have an adverse effect on their view. Based on when our product began, it would have required us to be clairvoyant to predict this occurrence. Project began. Subsequently, the property was purchased. We see the following benefits in our project: productivity in an area that's unsafe for other uses, considerably less noise and dust than our tillage, spraying, and harvesting currently creates, the opportunity to continue to farm in close proximity to the project. As a response to the opposition to the site based on causing a problem for the view for the proposed home, I would like to state that there was never any intent to cause problems with my neighbors. Beyond that, I would hope they consider changing the aspect of their view by changing the direction of the house to focus more on the Willamette Valley and not straight at an adjoining hill. It only takes a few degrees of change to make the project, which is a half-mile away, considerably less of a portion of their view. To date, I have not seen any building permit notices, so I have to assume that we're talking about a proposed home and not anything under current construction. It is difficult to form a business plan based on what might happen around you. I've been made aware of some issues in the past projects here and would like to state that my family and I did due diligence on the solar company and further noted that the county planning group had listed very strict rules that the company is required to follow in developing the project. In addition, I can promise you that we will be monitoring the activities of the company to ensure that they do not create any problems. We have not allowed any operators who have leased our property to neglect the land. I believe that the site is in a reasonable location and will provide excellent opportunity for success for solar production. Oregon has been a leader in alternative energy to fossil fuels, including hydro, wind, and solar sources. It flies in the face of those stated goals to move to a not-in-my-neighborhood response.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Commissioners, any questions or comments?
No questions.
Mr. Stevens, I have a couple of questions. You stated that your farm has been in your family for over a century and a half.
Yes.
Can you tell me that whether what you're doing now on your land is what was being done 153 years ago?
Of course not.
What are the different applications or the different farming uses that you've either heard about or been involved in the last, well, since you know of, since your family purchased the property in 1856?
Obviously, the family originally was farmed with horses.
I'm sorry?
Originally, the farm was farmed with horses, using horses. They had grain crops. They had some hay. They had some livestock. They had chickens, dairy cows, those types of things. Over the years, things have changed, and we've moved to field crops and moved to a grass seed intense program. But we've maintained the cherries and the plums for the last 55 years. We've increased those volumes and are looking at, as I mentioned, hazelnuts as another alternative. The end game for us is to have a complete farm, all in permanent crops. If we could convince somebody to plant grapes on that plot, we'd like to do that. But to date, and with the economy that we see out there, with very large companies coming in purchasing very large blocks, we see a lot of the small boutique wineries either being bought out or essentially being unprofitable. We don't want to go down that road.
So would you say that your intent is to keep your farm in your family, hopefully for another 150 years?
That'd be the way I'd like to see it. What I have to do right now is to trust my daughter and son-in-law to make that happen. But I have to set that up in an economic situation to where they will be successful. I can't let them walk into a situation where there's almost negligible profitability on a segment of the farm and expect them to be successful.
So this is a question, and I don't know, Ms. Armstrong, if you could answer this, and if you can't, that's fine. But Mr. Stevens mentioned that the next option, since nobody was interested, none of the wineries or no wineries seemed to be interested in using this parcel for planting grapes, the next option would be to plant into fir trees. If that were the case, would you know, even just off the top of your head, whether or not the tax revenue to the county would be more than the $10,000 if a solar array were sited there, or less because it was in, I'm guessing it's going to be in timber deferral if it is in fact planted in trees, and then the revenue to the county would be?
Yeah, I don't know for certain either, but my assumption would be then it would be in forest deferral, and that's a different taxing structure than a solar facility is.
So significantly less.
That would be my
That would-
assumption as well.
That is the assumption. Any other questions, comments, commissioners?
No.
Mr. Stevens, thank you very much. Next, I'd like to ask Haley, I'm sorry, I can't read your last name. Silton? Siltonen. Haley Siltonen, thank you. If you could state your name and address for the record, please.
So it's Haley Siltonen, for the record. Address is 760 Southwest 9th Street, Suite 520, Portland, Oregon. And I represent, my office represents Sulis, but I'm just going to stay out of it for now and be prepared to speak in rebuttal.
Okay, all right, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Hogan. Next, we'll move on to the opponent's case. And get a moment here to reset. And next up to bat will be Mr. Stilling.
Okay, I bet you can. I'm a time you. Sure to freeze me. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there you go. This is it. Cross your fingers. There you go.
Thank you. Mr. Stilling, if you'd state your name and address for the record, please.
Yes, my name is Jeff Styling, and my address where I currently reside is 11326 Southwest Meadowlark Lane in Beaverton, Oregon. And I am the owner of property directly south of the proposed site. So, thank you all for having me this morning. I've never done this before. I'm going to take you through a presentation to review our view of the situation and our opposition to the approval. And in doing that, I will navigate through some of the letter that I wrote and submitted electronically. So you may want to have that in hand just to follow with me if you could. I will start by reading the cover letter of my letter. So, dear Chair Sterrett and Commissioners, my wife Karen and I have been residents of Beaverton, Oregon for 24 and a half years. We are new landowners in Yamhill County, having purchased 41 acres of property located at 11751 Hoodview Road in May 2017. Our goal is to develop the property as a high-end vineyard and position the location and land to accommodate a winery in the future. Immediately upon purchasing the property, we began land development that continues to this day. The 16 acres of land for the vineyard are now completely prepared, and we will plant our first 7.5 acres of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay this fall. In addition, we have prepared a site for a new home and potential winery site on the top of the north hillside that faces the proposed solar facility, subject to this letter. Our property lies immediately to the south of and elevated above the proposed industrial solar facility that is the subject of this appeal. The proposed site is in plain view from our land, and its solar panels would be angled in a southerly direction. Had we known that such a facility was a possibility, and again, clairvoyance mentioned by Les, neither am I clairvoyant, we didn't know. Anyway, I continue. Had we known that such a facility was a possibility, we may not have invested significantly in this land. We deem this proposed facility as having a very negative impact on our property value by discouraging future winery development on our property, and indeed on having adverse impact on the entire Yamhill County agricultural community. As such, industrial use on high-value farmland will undermine the priorities the community has developed in the Yamhill County Comprehensive Plan. We are not at all opposed to alternative energy sources, solar included. Good stewardship of our planet demands we seek more eco-friendly and efficient sources of energy. But equally important is stewardship of the land and a balance between competing goals. We are seeking the board to reverse the approval of this project on the grounds that several of the conditions of approval have not been met. This letter, with the following summary of the Yamhill County staff report and attachments, provides the basis for our request. We also point out below arguments, as mentioned earlier, from an opposing county, arguments opposing county approval in a similar solar facility case as applicable to this case, in particular the Yamhill Creek Solar docket number 18-17/SDR-28-17. So I'll take you through a little bit of my background and my family background, the site overview, the criteria that we believe has not been met, and a summary. So my background is we've lived here for 24 and a half years. I grew up in other parts of the country. My father built a vineyard in Sonoma County about 30 years ago in California. I became the managing partner of that partnership and ran that business for about 10 years. We sold that land about a year and a half ago, and with some of the funds, we invested in property here in Yamhill County, as I mentioned. And this is directly south of the Stevens Farm. We have developed 16 acres for vineyard planting, which will begin this fall, about half this fall, and another 7 acres in the next 2 to 4 years. We also designed this so that we could qualify to place a winery on the site at some future point. We did harvest the hillside timber that's on our north slope, which faces the Stevens property. We did do that to, one, take advantage of the timber revenue. We have since replanted and replaced that timber with new seedlings. That helped us to create a view and to fund our project. Reserved view sites on the central ridge of the property for home and winery, so we've put and developed some area where we intended to put a home and then potentially a winery. We're also restoring an old farmhouse that will be a rental property. That farmhouse does not is not impacted view-wise by the proposed development to the north. So our key goals are to enhance the value of our property, to leverage the highest and best use as a premium grape vineyard, and preserve its farmland character. I think you're familiar with this, but this again is where we sit relative to the development site. So we're just to the south. A little bit more close in, you see as purchased, what we purchased. So this is a picture before we started developing the property. And then to the right, you can see we have clear cut and we have positioned these areas for home and winery. I want to point out that we may or may not build a winery. The issue is not whether we build one, it's to develop a property that has that potential. It increases the value of the property and it's consistent with what's going on around us. So yes, we may build a winery, no, we may not. But I think regardless, the issue is we have the right to use the property in that way, and we would like to retain the right to use it in that way and to not be impeded by it. Several criteria we believe were unmet in the approval of this project. I've highlighted the ones that I want to spend the most time on today. I think you'll hear from others regarding some of the ones that aren't highlighted. So I'm going to focus my attention on Yamhill County Zoning Ordinance 1202.02 as well as 1101.02. I believe that's a typo. I think that's 1102.02 and 1102.02, 2 and 4. I'm sorry, 1101.02, 2 and 4. So we'll take these in succession. The first one I want to talk about is the comprehensive plan. So the criteria here is there consistency between the project and what is in our comprehensive plan? Some considerations I want to talk about are specifically the plan goals and policies. And then I also want to inject in here some thoughts around solar energy trends, some long-term risks, and economic impact. The first point here that I would like to make, and I've described in my letter, is the idea that the comprehensive plan has many different areas that speak to the preservation of farmland, the preservation of the character of the county, the rural character of the county. And it does also speak to development of alternative energy utilities and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. But on balance, if you look at the number of policies and goals related to preserving the character of our county, the rural character of our county, and to be consistent with our agricultural background, it's my assertion that the preservation of farmland and our rural character are weighted heavily here. Some samples of the comprehensive plan that speak to my assertion, and these aren't all of them, but I just want to give you some examples. Rural development, Goal 1, Policy C. All proposed rural area development and facilities shall be appropriate, if not uniquely suited to the area or site proposed for development. Economic development, Goal 1, Policy D. Yamhill County will encourage economic development projects which do not conflict with the predominant timber and agricultural character of the county. A third example is industrial development, Goal 1, Policy B. To the greatest extent possible, industrial areas will be located within urban growth boundary. Another example, agricultural lands, Goal 1, Policy H. No proposed rural area development shall substantially impair or conflict with the use of farm or forest land or be justified solely or even primarily on the argument that the land is unsuitable for farming or forestry, or due to ownership is not currently part of an economic farming or forestry enterprise. Next, I want to just review some thoughts on risks, trends, and economics. So on the risk side, And this is the risk of placing a solar facility on high-value farm land. It's a long commitment, 25 to 40 years. Anything with that extends into time that long does present risks. We're removing the land for a long period of time, and whether or not we can recover that land later is in question, I believe. I don't think that we've seen adequate proof that we can recover this soil and this land back to a farming use. And so the effect on high-value soils is still, I think, debatable. We'll hear more about that later with other testimony. Tarnishing the character of the county. I realize this is just one project. It's just 8 acres, but we have several others. And as we start to see more and more of these, it does change the character of the county for a long time. And in my opinion, it impacts how I use my property and how I can use it for legitimate, approved reasons that affect me, and that includes things like agritourism. I'm going to have a tasting room. People are maybe not going to be so attracted to it if they have to have unsightly views. Industry trends and status. So here we've referenced some different articles in my submission, which you've probably seen before in other submissions. The first point is the cost of solar alternatives keep decreasing. That means things like solar panels on buildings, on places there's already a footprint, are coming down, and over time are going to become very close to what you see as the cost of solar facilities that are en masse in these multi-acre developments. Secondly, the trend is that our local electrical provider, PGE, has excessive credits already. In fact, the article that I reference here states that they have credits that will last them through the end of the next decade. The third is not all the power that's generated here stays here. So the amount of energy that's created locally goes into a grid where distribution of that electricity can go to any number of places. So whether or not we as a county benefit from that power generation is debatable. And then fourthly, there are many alternatives to placing solar utilities on high-value soils. And we reference a report that was done in California that we think applies here as well, that in the UC Davis report, there's an extensive amount of non-high-value locations that you could place these solar facilities on. Then from an economic perspective, I believe there's a negative impact to surrounding land values when you place this type of development within predominantly agricultural land use. There's no ongoing revenues to local employers or service providers or suppliers that are involved in farming for this land use. And the revenues and profits don't stay here. I believe that the company that will be operating this would be taking the money elsewhere. I do acknowledge that the county will enjoy approximately $10,000 in annual tax revenue that this will produce. And I acknowledge that Mr. Stevens will receive income from this, and he has every right to seek how to monetize his assets, and I respect that. So, but if you take all this and you look at the comprehensive plan, it's my assertion that it's farmland first. It's let's preserve our soils, let's preserve the character of this county over other competing interests, including alternative energy production. The second point is that current alternative energy objectives are met. PGE has exceeded their objectives and appear to be on track to do that for some time to come. If you couple that with trends in the technology, I believe we can wait before we start covering more high-valued soils. Let's take advantage of these trends. let's put solar production in more appropriate places and not cover up our coveted high-value soils. Nonetheless, solar, can still be pursued, again, in these alternative locations. Moving on to the Yamhill County Zoning Ordinance 1202.02 DNF. The short version is altering the character of the area that limits or impairs its use for approved uses and or is incompatible with the uses. Point 1, the proposed use will alter the character of the surrounding area in a manner that substantially limits, impairs, or prevents permitted uses. There is a clear view of the proposed project from sites we plan for future approved uses, namely a winery. Glare, we believe, is a real problem. I have a couple pictures I'll show on glare from a nearby project that we're really concerned about. A third point here, regarding the character of our county, there are many groups and individuals that share concern over solar utilities altering the rural character, including the Yamhill Carlton Wine Growers Association, Oregon Wine Growers Association, the Willamette Valley Wineries Association, the Yamhill County Soil and Water District, and Oregon Friends of Yamhill County. So it's not just me, it's a lot of people that have concerns. The applicant's lack of knowing our future plans does not diminish our rights. So I do understand that they did not know what we were going to be up to, but that doesn't diminish our right to do it. So I bring that as an argument. There are 3 points in the report that I do want to specifically address, and I'm going to turn to the section in my letter and just read those, if I may. So the first one is this idea that there's this vast swath view, that we have so big of a view that we can't necessarily control everything that comes into that view. I understand that, but this is really, and you'll see pictures here in a minute of what that view is for us. But my response to that comment is, how do you define vast view or a vast swath? How can it be used as a criterion to measure viewing impact on the character of the area? I think it's a subjective comment in the report and does not consider that an industrial solar facility may be a significant eyesore for the location we have planned for a home site and potential winery. The second is no view from the current structures. That is true. However, we have planned structures that are approved uses of the land. So yes, it was not known at the time, but it's very clear that we've positioned ourselves to put these structures in place. And then finally, nearby winery tasting room did not comment. I'm not sure who that was. I'd certainly like to know, based upon the staff report, which winery it was they're referring to that has this clear view to the property in question. All of those points that I just made there are on page 12 of my submission. So on glare, these are pictures of a nearby site in Sheridan that were taken in the recent past. So we see that there is glare coming off of these panels that you see even through the fence that's covering them. This is the view of the proposed site from where we had intended to put the home. A little bit further to the east would have been the winery. And so that's what it looks like today. And forgive my lack of great Photoshop skills, but this is my rendition of what it might look like if you were to put solar panels on that hillside. And again, as a reminder, you can see the positions of where we would place our facilities relative to that site. Economic factors. We believe there's a negative impact to surrounding land values. That has not been quantified. We think that it's the burden of the applicant to assure us that there's no negative impact. I see nothing where we've been assured that we're not going to be losing value as a result of the project. No ongoing revenues to local employers, service providers, suppliers from farming on this particular piece of property. Revenues and profits do not stay in Yamhill County. Collectively, these facilities do reduce farming on land for 25 to 40 years, eliminating them from ongoing farming activity. Additional considerations. A shift in technology that renders this project unviable. I don't know whether that's likely or not, but I can tell you that the technology is changing rapidly. I have a long history of a career in information technology. It changes rapidly. It's possible, and it's happened many times in the technology industry, where changes and shifts in technology basically render earlier technologies unviable. They cannot compete, and they no longer can produce, in this case, energy viably at a cost that is going to be accepted by the public. So that's a risk. Far greater remediation at the end of life than calculated is a potential risk. And I guess my question there would be for the applicant is, do you have any experience in closing down a solar facility and remediating the site? You know, what's the background? What's the history of doing things like that? Do we know? Do we even know? Third is a change in operators. And oftentimes there are changes in ownership and operations of these facilities. We've seen it already in the county. And the question I have there is, what's their viability? What if they go bankrupt? Who gets left holding the bag on 8 acres of solar panels that no one wants to run? Just questions that I'm concerned we don't necessarily have really good answers for. Zoning Ordinance 110202, Section 4, provision for noise, visual buffering. I've really talked about the visual buffering, I think, and the issues there. And as far as buffer, I don't see how we can even create a buffer with the view angles that I've shown you. The hillside's pretty steep, so to plant something to create that buffer would essentially block everything out from those planned building sites. And that concludes a summary of my letter and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Styling. Commissioners, do you have questions, comments?
No questions from me.
Okay, thank you very much. I think what we'll do is take a 5-minute recess and then come back. And what I want to ask is if the opponents, if your remarks and the concepts you want to convey have already been addressed, if you could maybe just keep those remarks instead of going through the same information, that would be appreciated. So let's just take a 5-minute recess and then come back, and we'll continue with Emily is up after that. Thank you. And next up to bat is Emily Malloy. Is that, am I saying that? I can't read that. Okay, yes, Emily. And if you could state your name and address for the record, Emily?
Hello, I'm Emily Malloy. I live at 29870 Southwest Mill Creek Road, Sheridan, Oregon, directly across the street from Mill Creek Solar Array. Some of you recognize me for being here, and yet again, I'm saying, please, no more solar arrays on high-value farmland. I know you've put in the moratorium on, and there was a window of time for applications to come in, and boy, did they come in. I'd still say, please, no more solar on high-value farmland. Yamhill County was established. We had farming and agriculture community since before Yamhill County was established. All the land that can be farming and agriculture, I wish would stay farming and agriculture and not keep pockmarking our county with the solar arrays. So I've said this many times, so I'm making it brief because I'm just repeating myself time and again. Anyway.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next up, Rob? Is it Kistler? Okay, good. Mr. Kistler. And your name and address, please?
Rob Kistler. I live at 4875 Millie's Lane in Amity. And that is on the west slope of the Amity Hill, above Amity, and just above Amity Vineyards, if people are familiar with where Amity Vineyards are. I also am not typically doing this type of thing, so I don't necessarily have the right protocol. I know as Jeff put up his list, there were two top things at the top. One was glare, and the other was erosion. And those are the two topics that I would like to discuss. I sent a letter in yesterday afternoon. Hopefully you all have it. In there are some graphics and some text that I copied from the applicant's presentation that I'm going to be referencing. Regarding glare, in June, looking out to the west, we have a good view of the Van Duzer corridor. There is a solar array out there about 2 miles from us. We get a significant glare off of it in the month of June to the point where you can't look at it. It's so bright. It's really kind of odd when you start thinking of its location, the location of the sun, which is actually to the north of where the array is sitting. But it has to do with the angle of the array, the angle of the solar incidence, and the reflection, which happens to hit our house. It just lasts a month. We don't consider it a really big deal. But with the applicant making a comment that there will be no glare because the sun light that hits the panels goes back to the sky is absolutely not true. In my presentation, I did a quick drawing assuming an angle of 27 degrees for their array, which I got off of their drawing, kind of doing some scaling. And you end up with a reflection on June 21st, the day he says there would be no glare, of a 15-degree angle to the horizontal off of those panels. That's one point in time during the year. I know, because I'm an architect, and we actually had this software in my office because we did glare studies off of buildings. There is software that will map the glare off of any surface onto any other surface 365 days of the year. So there is software that could tell you exactly how much glare you're going to get on Jeff's site. It's expensive, and I don't know how to operate it, but there were people in the office that did. What I'd like to go back to is the erosion potential. I think the documentation that you commissioners were given to make your decision was misleading. I think it's not truthful, as with the glare issue. And I think you made a good decision based on the information you had, assuming the information was accurate, when in fact I don't believe it is. The applicant, his first thing, presented a slide from his compaction and erosion control. If you look closely at the details from that, one of them, which shows the entrance into the space, and it's copied in my drawing, says it's for residential construction. It shows a concrete road, concrete curbs, and compacted gravel. There's, one of the details shows a mound of soil covered in plastic. They said they're not going to remove any soil, so why is the detail there? The other one shows the erosion fence that they'll put in. And if you look at that detail, the plastic goes 6 inches below the soil for an undefined distance horizontal. In order to do that, you have to excavate the soil, which apparently wasn't going to be much disturbance of the soil. You're supposed to remove the soil when it gets to 10 or a third the height of the fence. The fence is 30 inches high, so when you get 10 inches of soil, the erosion against the fence, you're supposed to remove it. My question would be, where do you remove it to and how do you remove it? Because if it's got there, the hillside is rather muddy and you're not going to take a truck or a tractor or machinery up the hill with the soil. So the soil that hits the fence, where does it go when you remove it? Something that was totally overlooked in that process of erosion is a construction process. There were two reports there. One of them states that water will sheet down the hill the same as it does today. So there will be no erosion because the water will sheet the same. The process of developing this site, which is reasonably steep. I have a vineyard. It's about the same steepness as this. We cleared that, put a vineyard in. So I'm really familiar with how you deal with this type of slope. In order to prep the soil, you've got to get those trees off. That typically is going to take an excavator for the size of those trees, because they'll have to pull them. They're cherry trees. They tend to grow back from their roots, so you've got to get the roots out of the ground. When you pull these trees, there's going to be holes and mounds of dirt, so you're going to have to go back with something to level off the soil so you can then put your next effort on it. What that will ultimately do is take all the vegetation off the hill. So the hill will no longer be in the state that it currently is. So when you hit rain on that soil, it will not sheet as it does today because the disturbances of the trees and the plants is what diverts the water run and spreads it out over the soil so you don't get the erosion. They will then come back on that soil that has been disturbed and start putting in the solar array. That's going to require equipment to carry the heavier products up the hill and an awful lot of people walking back over it's about a 3-month construction process. People walking back and forth on the same path, putting in the electrical, the panels, and assembling this whole process. The soil is clay. I have the same type of soil on my site. If you transfer back and forth along disturbed soil, it turns to powder. The powder is then really easily kicked around, and you create unintentional pathways. They're going to be running parallel to where the arrays are put. The arrays do not necessarily go along the topographic lines. They go along an east-west axis to get ideal solar collection. So the fall line of the hill is not perpendicular to the array. When the water sheets off the panels from the rain, they're 14-foot wide, 8-foot rows according to the drawing. You get like lots of water sheeting off those panels, falling into the pathway that was created by the people and the machinery walking. It will follow the line of least resistance down that pathway, creating erosion, because they will not have the landscaping or the crops put back in to stop that erosion. It's going to follow that pathway until it finds its way down the hill, eventually collecting more and more water, collecting gutters or gullies, and taking a lot of erosion down the hill to this fence that's down at the bottom of the hill, which it will then pile up against. My prediction with that is, unless some other measures are put in that are not listed in the documents, one heavy rain in November will overwhelm that fence. You're going to bring so much soil down that steep slope that you'll bury that fence. Around the perimeter of the site, inside the fence, the erosion control fence, is a 20-foot wide axis. It doesn't define what it is, but my assumption would be it'd be a gravel pathway because of the steepness of the hill. You can't drive a truck up it. You'd need the gravel. The dirt would turn to mud. You just slip and slide. So I assume that's a gravel path around it. At the bottom of the site, outside of that erosion fence, is a staging area. The staging area has about 15 feet of fall across it. I don't know the dimensions of it, but it's fairly large. that area has to be leveled. You can't stage equipment on a slope. So they're going to be cutting and filling, and then they're going to have to put tons of rock in that area to be able to work off that pad. There's no discussion of what the pad's made of, and how do you turn that back to farmable land. With that much rock packed into it, it's a fairly large area. The runoff from the hill will eventually dump the topsoil on that area. If it gets across that, it'll go into the pond. But all of that is totally ignored in their documentation, where they say there will be no erosion and the water will come off the hill in the same manner in which it comes off today. And I think just common sense tells you that's not true. They also talk about putting in native vegetation. Anybody who has developed a vineyard has attempted to do the same thing. Most of us are very good stewards of the land. What you do is plant a very fast-growing grass early in the fall to try to retain the soil. It's not native grass. It's grass that will get roots down and try to hold that soil in place. Then you go back year after year and you mow that and you try to get the native vegetation to come in. And it is a very long-term process, but you have to be able to mow it. You also have what my wife refers to as seed rain, which brings in all of the weeds. The weeds we maintain by mowing them down. I don't know how you mow in a solar array. I have a 10 kilowatt solar array. I can weed whack it, but I cannot get a mower in there. And he talked about hand mowing, but you don't hand mow 8 acres of hillside. That's a very difficult process. So I really question that you're going to be able to keep the weeds down, and you're going to be able to establish native vegetation, that you're going to be able to get the soil on this hillside stabilized in time to keep winter rains from taking it off the hill. I think that's a real stretch, and what you accepted and voted on was their reports that stated that that would be the case. It would not be a problem. So that's the basis of my response. And one comment to Mary, you'd asked, no, again, sorry, it's the lady from the county, what would be the tax revenue loss or gain if it went from we'll say $10,000 to forest farmland or to forestry? What would be the tax loss if Mr. Stilling and others did not put in their winery because they couldn't? Think the tax dollars from the wine world far outstretches any tax dollars that you're going to see from solar. It is the fastest growing industry in the state, and Yamhill County produces more wine revenue in the state than any other county in the state. Most of your wine revenue comes from here, so that's my...
Thank you, sir. Carl Muska?
Hello,
Hello?
my name is Carl Muska, and I live at 109 Southeast Eola Hills Road, and an immediate neighbor to Jeff Styling. I'm the owner and manager of 2 vineyards that directly overlook the site for the proposed 8-acre solar array. As background, I earned a PhD in fisheries and wildlife biology from Oregon State University. Before becoming a farmer in Yamhill County, I worked in the water quality and environmental protection fields for 40 years, including teaching environmental risk assessment and management at the University of Delaware for 20 years. My farm, and it's actually 2 tax lots, is directly west of Jeff and Karen and overlooks the site of the proposed commercial electrical production facility directly to the north. I should state at the beginning that I am not against solar. I have solar panels on my barn and participate very successfully in the feed-in tariff program selling electricity to PG&E. It's a great source of revenue for me. However, the reason the panels are on my barn and not covering my land is I recognized early on through soil analyses and standard due diligence practices how valuable our soils are and how uniquely suited they are for growing wine grapes. Since this high-value nature of these soils is not a secret, I, like Jeff, paid dearly for the farmland over 13 years ago. The value of the vineyard land in this area has only gone up since then, and I'll get to some hard numbers on that a little bit later. What is absolutely astonishing to me is that this application was approved given the proposed site for the solar array meets all definitions of high-valued farmland, and quite frankly, this current piece of property represents some of the highest valued farmland in Yamhill County. So there's high-valued farmland, and then there's really high-valued farmland, and I'll try to point that out a little bit later. I've owned my land since 2005, so I can provide you some historical perspective of the growth of the wine industry in this area. Previously, my farm was planted in Italian prunes and cherries, as were most of the farms historically along the Eola Hills Road. However, I converted to wine grapes. Why did I do that? The pioneers of the wine industry discovered in the 1970s, so this is not new news, that the east slopes of the Eola Hill and Amity Hills are capable of producing world-class Pinot Noir wine. The combination of the cooling winds from the Van Duzer corridor and these soils make this possible. So you're going to see a constant theme, as in the theme of my other presenters regarding soils. The original Eola Hills farm, now the Brooks Estate Vineyard, which is just up the road from me, was planted in 1974. There are now 12 producing vineyards on this one road, just this one road. This is not all of Eola Hills. And at the time of this testimony, there are at least 6 more vineyards being planned, including the stylings. When I started planting, there were 4 vineyards. So from 2005 to now, there have been 8 more vineyards and 6 in the works. This is high growth rate on high valued property. There are currently 3 wineries on the hill and 2 more are being considered. There's also a high-end bed and breakfast that recently went in on the west side of the Eola Hills Road. And I'll let you do the math on what the winery and growth rate has been on this hill, but clearly the market has spoken as to the value of these soils and the economic value this brings to Yamhill County. The visitors in the winery tasting rooms come by limo, buses, and yes, by helicopters now. And those staying in the high-end bed and breakfast are not staying in the area in search of solar arrays. The growth industry is grapes in the agriculture use of high-valued soils and not covering these soils with solar panels. Farming and the protection of our most precious resource, our soil, is consistent with the goals of the county comprehensive plan. I don't have this in my notes, but I attend every year the Oregon Wine Growers Symposium in February. And every year, the Oregon Wine Board sponsors Silicon Bank, who is an expert in the wine industry, come up and give a state of the state of the Oregon wine industry. And this year they came up and says, well, we've got nothing for you because Oregon has the highest average bottle prices of wine anywhere else in the world, and you have double-digit growth rates. So this is a growth industry. Now, there was some indication about small wineries that have been bought out from California. That's changing. I think the reason that some vineyards are being turned over now is because there are people like me. They're 70 years old and you can't do this forever because those are when people got started in this industry. And I think most people would agree that the California people coming in and buying is helping the industry and not hurting the industry. And that was made very public, matter of documentation by this group that comes on and does marketing and assesses our industry every year. The soils in the east and southeast slopes of the Yola Hills are responsible for producing grapes from which world-class wines are being produced. This is a fact. This is not speculation. The farm being considered for the solar arrays has similar soils and slopes, the value of which is demonstrated by the fact that it has 2 operating vineyards on the site, and one of which is immediately adjacent to the proposed solar site. Real estate professionals have a term for evaluating and valuing land called highest and best use. I hope with this historic perspective that I have convinced you that the soils in questions are very unique and the highest and best use is growing grapes. A lot has been said about the soil, so in deference to what the chair has said, I will not go through this. But I provide additional information, and I know the theme is it's all about the soils. And if you put solar arrays on top of these soils, you're going to compact them, you're going to change the soil structure, you're going to change what is a very point that hasn't been made, the water holding capacity of our soils. Yola Hills is in a water restricted area. We cannot irrigate. We have to dry farm. Having good water holding capacity is critical to our success in growing grapes. And I can say with some assurance, having done this for a number of years, that the disturbances that are going to be undergone, just like Rob was pointing out through this solar, are going to change the characteristic of that soil, and that soil will not come back. You too can be an expert looking at vineyards. Good time of the year is now. Look up at vineyards and look for yellow spots or areas which aren't as green as the other. Those are areas where there could be disease, but many times when I've investigated, it's some past human activity, either a borrow pit, a burn pit, or maybe even a natural activity such as a landslide. Those soils are not producing or capable of producing the same quality of grapes. The plants aren't as healthy, and it's quite visible when you look up and see that. I will skip down to, I do reference some of the criteria and how they are, hopefully you'll see my data, are not being met by the current application. In absence of data to the contrary, glare has to be considered a major issue. I don't personally, from my house, see the subject property. However, I can sight down my north-south rows of my vineyard, and it points directly to the property. So the proposed site for the array. So I am due south from the prospective property. I have a right-of-way road that I maintain for people that live along the ridge that's formed. So what you have is you have Yola Hills running north-south, and you have our ridge running east-west, okay? And my rows, which run exactly north-south, are pointed directly at the property. At the end of my right-of-way road that I maintain, there are 2 expensive houses. We call these view properties with big decks, and they directly overlook the array. So saying that other people are not impacted, anybody on that ridge, they have developed their property such that they do take advantage of the views, and this will be highly visible to them. And there are several properties in this area, so I take exception to what the first speaker said regarding that fact. So in absence to the contrary, I think glare has to be considered a major problem. At some time, at some point, there's going to be glare off of those panels. It's the geometry of the situation. The ridge is at a higher level than the panels and the north-south orientation that I've described. A primary goal of the Yamhill County Comprehensive Plan is to protect and preserve high-end farmland. And we've said that by several people here. And so I've ended with that statement in my testimony. I do have a couple other comments I wanted to address in notes that I made. The first one I've already made, this was for the first speaker. Low visual impact is a ridiculous statement. All you have to do is go out there and look at it. The soil plan begs the question of soil remedies by whom and when? Who determines when compaction requires remediation, and how is that determined? This was said earlier, but native seed mixes are very difficult to germinate on land, level ground, much less on a slope. So having just spent 3 days cultivating my rows and cover my slopes with fast-growing cover crop for the winter, I can tell you that it takes specialized equipment, and it takes a lot of money, and it takes a lot of attention. And I'm doing these in defined 6-foot rows where the equipment is designed to do the job at hand. And I spend a lot of time and effort doing that. And I can tell you that no contract company is going to give the same care to erosion control as a farmer will, whose livelihood is depending upon being able to control and save that soil. There was some statement about mechanical harvesting of, we don't mechanical harvest grapes in this area. There's some areas that do mechanical harvesting, but on our slopes and our hills and for high quality grapes, this is all done by hand harvesting. So the statement made about not suitable for mechanical harvesting is really just a red herring. The statement that the site is buffered by view by the Douglas fir, I absolutely don't know where that's coming from. There are Douglas fir mixed hardwood forests, but buffered? I think not, when we have actual tax-paying lot holders that have view properties on the ridge that look down on this property, and I guarantee you they work hard to maintain their views. This is not about anti-solar arguments. We're all for soil. It's about the soil. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sid Freeman.
Chair Sterrett, Commissioners, Sid Friedman representing Friends of Yamhill County, Post Office Box 1083, McMinnville. You should have in your packet written testimony that was previously submitted from our organization. Friends of Yamhill County is very supportive of renewable energy projects, including solar facilities, but we are deeply concerned about the cumulative effect of the escalating conversion of our best agricultural lands to non-agricultural uses. The industrial energy facility proposed in this docket would be located on high-value soils and displace a portion of a cherry orchard and continue to chip away at the finite supply of high-value farmland that sustains our vital agricultural sector of our economy. The criteria for this application require consistency with a comprehensive plan, and the proposed facility is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan for the following reasons and should be denied. Jeff Stilling went into, in general ways, some of the comprehensive plan. I want to drill down a little deeper. In particular, I want to talk about what this Board of Commissioners has previously found. A majority of the board previously found, and I'm quoting, commercial solar facilities on class 1 through 4 soils has the potential to materially alter the land use patterns and make it more difficult for the existing farms in the area to continue operation and destabilize the overall character of the area. In a previous staff report on a specific solar array application that came before you, your staff noted that one of the key features of successful agriculture is the location and availability of appropriate soils. Again, I'm quoting. Agriculture needs the soils, especially the high-value soils, to grow their crops. That is why soils are prominent both in the comprehensive plan and in the zoning ordinance. I'm continuing to quote your staff here. Chipping away at the availability of high-value farmland, especially when there are other options, appears to threaten the overall integrity and viability of the agricultural land use base. And your staff concludes by saying, these are the issues the decision makers will want to consider when determining whether this application complies with the Yamhill Comprehensive Plan. Subsequent to the issuance of that guidance from your staff, a majority of this board found that the following. Solar facilities do not need to be placed on class 1 through 4 soils, and because those soils are of central importance to the agricultural economy of the county, protecting those soils from numerous 12-acre soil arrays is more consistent with the comprehensive plan than allowing additional arrays. With respect to another plan policy in the rural area, policy C, this Board of Commissioners found the following. And I'll truncate the quote just to the conclusion to be brief. The board finds that high-value farmland is irreplaceable and should not be sacrificed for industrial-sized facilities. So that's what this board has already found. With respect to economic goals and policies in the comprehensive plan, this board has found that citing solar installations, and I'm quoting, citing solar installations on high-value farmland is not in the short or long-term economic interest of the county. This goal and policy, the economic goals and policies, weigh in favor of denial of the proposed facility. As your staff has pointed out elsewhere in other proceedings, commercial solar facilities may be sited almost anywhere. These industrial facilities do not require our best agricultural lands. Because agricultural uses of high-value farmland capture local renewable solar energy and use it locally to produce crops, they are at least as consistent with the energy plan goals and policies as solar arrays. These should be the last sites considered for commercial solar arrays. I want to touch on one other issue that hasn't been addressed yet today. The applicant in their application states that they made an extensive GIS search of agricultural lands within our county and found that there is very little land suitable for their development other than high-value soils. But they presented no evidence of having looked for more appropriate non-agricultural land, including land within urban growth boundaries. And as you well know, there are solar arrays that were originally proposed on farmland, later located into the urban growth boundary of Sheridan, later located in the urban growth boundary of Amity. There are alternative sites. There just may not be as cheap and quick to develop as farmland. And in the present case, the applicant proposes a location on high-value soils, even though there are non-high-value soils on the subject tract. And he states that this site was chosen because of the plans to remove the cherry orchard. And while I don't dispute that he's tried to lease the land for grape production, There's no evidence in the record that it can't be used for hazelnuts, for grass seed, grain crops, hay, or a host of other crops that are farmed profitably here on high-value soils in Yamhill County. The applicant did state, well, that the next option would be fir, but the only real reason he had for justifying not putting it into timber production was that it would be less tax revenue for the county. And frankly, in weighing the consistency with a comprehensive plan, tax revenue to the county is not a factor to be addressed, especially when it's so minimal as $10,000 a year. So I guess I'd just like to conclude by stating the following. The board has previously determined that citing commercial solar facilities on high-value agricultural lands is inconsistent with the goals and policies of the plan, the comprehensive plan, relating to rural area development, economic goals, industrial development, and agricultural lands. And while these previous interpretations of the plan are not binding on you in this current application, it's clearly favored to have consistent findings across various decisions, consistent interpretations of the plan, so your interpretations of the comprehensive plan are not changing week to week, month to month, based on whatever application is before you. For those reasons, we believe you should not change your interpretations that you previously made unless there are strongly compelling arguments that your previous interpretations were wrong, and I simply have not heard that here today. So that concludes what I had planned to say. There's just one quick piece of rebuttal I want to get in here, and that is that the applicant seemed to argue that PGE's renewable energy portfolio standards should somehow justify placing this industrial energy facility on high-value Yamhill County soils. And I just want to point out that there's been plenty of testimony and evidence in other proceedings that those portfolio standards have been met, have been and will be met without this project, and regardless, PGE portfolio standards should not dictate your interpretations of our criteria and our plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Excuse me. Ms. Orrego?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Chair Starrett, Commissioner, staff. Ximena Orrego, reside at 20501 Northwest Russell Creek Road, Yamhill. So thank you for the opportunity to comment on this matter. This application in review today is very, very similar to the proposed solar facility next to our home and vineyard. As such, I really relate to the Styling family. I understand what they're trying to do with their property. I understand the dreams that they had for developing this property. And I'm just really sad that they have to go through the roller coaster that we have experienced as a family and business. So once again, I want to voice our concern that solar panels, which could be placed almost anywhere, will take away from this high-value farmland supply that we have in our county. Industrial solar facilities really have no place in our high-value farmland. So a lot has been said about the soil, and there's a lot of evidence in the record already that establishes that solar installations destroy soil biology, so I won't say too much about that. However, I want to just point out that the soil plan that was submitted and that the staff report showed was satisfactory. I just want to point out that the county does not need to use that sole report to accept it as evidence to prove compliance with the standards, right? There's no proof really or evidence from previous projects that the land use for these solar facilities can actually be reverted for farm use. And that's the bottom line. There's just no evidence. How can these thousands of poles that are going to be driven into the soil, once they removed, we just don't know. So why would we take a chance on something that is not necessary? We have also brought up, as well as others, that the cumulative impacts of the conversion of farmland to these non-farm uses threatens the Yamhill County's vibrant agricultural and agritourism economies, as well as our wine industry. You've heard a lot about that. But in contrast, it has been made very clear also that industrial solar arrays bring almost no economic benefit to local residents or to ratepayers. There's also no way to assert that the energy produced by them is being used locally, especially when the supply exceeds the demand. So this is a point that Commissioner Olson actually brought up during one of the formal sessions in April when docket G0117 was discussed. Additionally, the applicant himself has disclosed in their FERC Form 556 that this facility will deliver output from the facility into the interstate grid. So there's no guarantee that it's going to stay local. As part of my letter that I submitted to you, I also included testimony from the VP of Transmission and Distribution of PGE, who confirmed the same. So the staff report, they concluded that this proposed solar facility would satisfy the goal of energy conservation, which actually reads, to promote the conservation of existing depletable energy resources and the development of local renewable resources to ensure that an adequate supply will be available to Yamhill County citizens at a reasonable cost. Now, again, the staff report concluded that what they're doing with this power facility, that goal would be, it would be satisfied, but it would be done at the expense of sacrificing the goal and policy related to the preservation of high-value agricultural lands. So I would encourage you to disagree with that conclusion from the staff when it is clear that rates will not change for local residents and that there's no guarantee that the energy will stay local. As in other projects, the applicant plans to sell their energy to PGE. In response to the points that we made in our previous letter, the applicant stated that they, and in our previous letter, what we were highlighting was the fact that PGE has already met their renewable targets through their credit system, which is something that Mr. Friedman just pointed out as well. But in rebuttal to that, the applicant has stated that the Oregon Public Utility Commission has determined that PGE still needs to secure more renewable generators in their pipeline. And they arrived at that conclusion because the Public Utility Commission is still requiring PGE to pay a price that works for the renewable generators. We couldn't, this seems to be their own conclusion. We couldn't find any evidence to support that, but I would venture to say that regardless of that, there's certainly no mandate from the Oregon Public Utility Commission that they should meet these renewable targets by doing so at the expense of high-value farmland. So once again, there's no need to sacrifice our beautiful and valuable farmland to these industrial-type uses when there are more appropriate alternatives. So the applicant is really only pursuing their own interest in entering into this agreement. There's no requirement that the county should approve these conditional uses, and we ask you to please strongly consider rejecting the application. An industrial use such as this proposed solar plant that is not immediately necessary and provides no real benefits for our local community should never be elevated above the agricultural use of our high-value farmland. On balance, it would never be consistent with the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. So we respectfully ask the board to reject this application and overturn the planning department's decision. Now, as a board, you previously voted to protect our farmland and denied the application next to our property. I ask you to please consider doing the same today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, public agency reports. Do we have any?
No additional public agency reports.
Thank you very much. And it's time for rebuttal. Understandable.
So I'm going to start us off, and I'm going to leave room for Connor to respond to some of the more technical points. So some of the issues that have been raised that are a bit, Connor has more knowledge of, the PG&E credits and the local power and glare and decommissioning and erosion issues Connor's going to respond to. But I want to start off just by reading some of the written testimony that came in and also some of the things that have been said in testimony today that I've written down. So the first is that Mr. Seilings put this in his appeal letter. We disagree that this project or any project like it balances the goals of the county's comprehensive plan. And we've also heard that growing grapes is the best use of this land and that solar has no place in rural areas. So I think these comments get to the core of the issue, and that is that there's a lot of people who have testified here today that don't think that solar should be in the EFU zones. And that's a completely fair opinion, and it's an opinion that this county has shared by amending its zoning code, which I believe went into effect in August to limit the areas where solar can be put in EFU zones. And while we respect that, this application was submitted prior to those code amendments, and those judgments about the use of land for solar versus growing grapes or other agriculture, those are policy decisions that are made when you write your plan, and it's not appropriate to use those policy decisions when you're reviewing an individual project application. So Mr. Styling wrote in his letter, and he purchased property in 2017, and he says, quote, "Had we known that such a facility was a possibility, we may not have invested significantly in this land." And he goes on to state, "Since purchasing our property in May 26, 2017, we have heavily invested in vineyard land development, logging, and forestry management that substantiates our claims. And the applicant's lack of knowledge of our intentions prior to their application does not diminish our rights as adjacent property owners to unimpeded approved uses of our property." So this county approved solar projects before 2017, and they are listed as allowed conditional uses in the prior version of the county's code that was in effect when Mr. Styling bought his property. And Sulis relied on the county's code when they were trying to find locations to put solar projects. And if solar facilities were not permitted as conditional uses under the county's code at that time, I can guarantee we wouldn't be sitting here, and they wouldn't have put the time into doing GIS searches and contacting property owners and preparing site plans and compaction plans and weed control plans. None of that would have happened if solar wasn't a allowed conditional use. And so I think the issue here today is this project, and I'll go on to talk about it, but there's a lot of things that make this project really well suited for the site that it's going to be at. And it's kind of hard to imagine if this project doesn't satisfy the conditional use criteria that were in effect before August 2018, it's hard to imagine that any project would. And that's if there's no solar project that could be approved under the old version of the conditional use criteria, that's not a legally defensible argument for denying a project because they are a conditionally allowed use. And so I'm going to kind of go into some specific issues that were raised today. And I want to start with the wine industry. And I want to break it down a bit because I feel like there's a few separate points that have been raised. And I think the first one is what impact this project has on just Yamhill County's thriving wine industry, just generally. And this came up with respect to the Yamhill Creek project. First off, unlike the Yamhill Creek project, this project is barely even visible from the highway. And I drove out there and looked just because I really was curious, like how hilly is it? How visible is it? It's hardly visible. There's one existing winery near the project, Mystic Wines, and I think Mr. Seiling said he wasn't sure what winery that was. I think he mentioned them in their letter, and they're on the same hill that his proposed winery is located on. They're not here testifying today. There's really only we've heard We've heard one other gentleman with a winery testify, but he doesn't have a view of this project. There's nothing about this project that would impact the wine industry generally. And so I think it's a stretch to say, people have been saying that the highest and best use of the land is grapes, but it's really hard to imagine how this project specifically could harm the county's wine industry. Mr. Stevens has tried to lease this parcel for grapes, and no one's bit. It's very little visual impact because it's not really seen from the highway. And then I think that kind of goes into the next point, is that aside from the county's general wine industry, there's also the issue of how does this project potentially affect Mr. Styling's future vineyard? And going to that, I first want to just be clear, this project doesn't affect his ability to grow grapes, and I don't think he's made that argument. We're in no way going to affect his ability to actually grow grapes. I believe that the effect that he has brought up is that the visual impact could potentially affect his ability to draw people to his tasting room, although my understanding is that he's not sure whether or not there will be a tasting room. My response to that is I don't believe Mr. Stevens is obligated to manage his land in a way that protects Mr. Styling's view in order to attract people to his tasting room. I think that's not what the code requires. The conditional use criteria are whether or not we would significantly affect an allowed use under the code. We wouldn't affect his ability to grow grapes. We are located a substantial distance away, and so I don't believe that a potential view impact rises to the level in the conditional use criteria of substantially impacting his ability to have a winery. So I would say this specific project with regard to the wine industry is, I don't think that's a justification for denying the project. I'm responding to, excuse me while I flip through. Another issue raised by Mr. Styling was that and a couple other persons testifying, is that there's an extensive amount of non-high value farmland available. I'll start within Yamhill County. Connor testified that they looked along three-phase electricity lines, and that's just not the case in the Willamette Valley, or in Yamhill County for sure, and also in the Willamette Valley. The ability to be on non-high value farmland sites along three-phase electricity is really, really limited. Another issue that you raised right in the beginning was looking at Eastern Oregon, and Connor responded to that in many respects. The point that I wanted to add, just because I'm from Eastern Oregon, is that there's pushback against energy projects anywhere. So I grew up in La Grande, and we have some really big wind projects out there that are, I don't know how the money works, but I assume that they're very large. So I assume they're large enough to cover the cost of infrastructure. But there was a lot of opposition to these wind projects. And I mean, I don't know if you guys know Eastern Oregon, but like North Powder, there's no one in North Powder. And yet there was still really, really strong opposition. So I would say, I would say that there's challenges to any site. A lot of other parts of Oregon, you're dealing with species issues. When you start to look in more urban areas, as Connor mentioned, the closer you get to people, the more conflicts you have with residential uses. So I'm not trying to downplay the value of farmland. I'm just saying I don't think there's any location that's really, without pushback. Another thing that Mr. Styling talked about is he cited that many wine associations have concerns about solar generally, and maybe that's the case in places where they're very visible for persons visiting wine country, but those wine industries aren't here testifying today. And I think I would hazard to guess that that's because this is not a super visible location, and so it really does have a lower impact on the wine industry, generally speaking. Something that was also touched on is what's the viability, what's the security we have for decommissioning if Sulis goes bankrupt. And as a condition of approval, and which Sulis has agreed to, there's a security to cover the cost of, I think it's 1.25 times the estimated cost of decommissioning. And I don't know the estimated decommissioning cost off the top of my head. So 80,000, so 1.25 times that. So there is security, there is some security built in to make sure that decommissioning happens regardless of what the situation is. Responding to some of Mr. Musk's testimony, he questioned the point that the property is bordered by trees, and he really said quite a bit about the visual impacts of the property. I would note that several neighbor letters were sent, and yet we've only had 2 people here to testify today who have properties that are potentially within lines of sight of the project. Mr. Musk said that he isn't actually within line of sight of the project, that there are properties around him that are. Mr. Styling is within line of sight of the project. But I think it says a lot that there's really only one person who's going to have to look at the project that's testified here today. So I would say to me, that's pretty strong evidence that the visual impact for persons in that area isn't that strong, because if it were, they would be speaking here today, and that's not the case. I'd also respond that, we've been talking a lot about views, and I don't want to just let it go by that, a view is a reason to deny a project. I think potentially, and the board has explained this, and in your earlier decisions, that view may be a cause for denying a project if the view is such that it has potential to hurt the wine industry, hurt tourism industry. But just individuals' preferences over their views, that doesn't rise to the level of impacting people's ability to use their property. And so I would say in this case, because it's really not, the impact is not affecting, with the exception of Mr. Styling's potential not yet developed winery, which would be one winery, there's really no impact to the wine industry. One point that I just wanted to clear up regarding mechanical harvesting, Mr. Musk said that no one uses mechanical harvesting, so the inability to mechanically harvest on the hill is not a basis for using solar, but we just wanted to clarify that the mechanical harvesting we were talking about was for cherry trees, not wine, or not grapes. So that was the barriers, the cherry tree harvesting technology. Responding to Mr. Friedman's testimony, and a lot of the written testimony quoted extensively from this board's decision with regard to Yamhill Creek. And I've looked closely at that board order, and I did note in that order that you declined to follow findings that were made with regard to a previous solar project. And the reason that you did that is because it's a different project. Yamhill Creek was a different project from projects that have been approved. And so you specifically said findings have to be specific to a project. And so I would say, you're not bound by a previous decision that was made with regard to a different project. This project is, there's a lot of things about this project that make it unique, and I really want to highlight them. First of all, it's 2/3 the size of a lot of the solar facilities that have been approved in this county. And the reason that it's 2/3 the size is because the location was planned in conjunction with the landowner. And the reason that this specific area was chosen is because this is something that he would be pulling the cherry trees, and he's not going to be raising cherry trees on it regardless. And so that's how we came to this project size and this project location. It's surrounded by land that's actively farmed by Mr. Stevens, and I can't remember who who testified to this effect, but someone said, well, this is a long-term project, so we don't know what's going to happen, in 25 or 30 years or the life of the project. I would say Mr. Stevens' family has been on this land for, almost a century and a half. So when we're talking in terms of long-term commitment to the area, we have the person right here who is most invested in making sure that the long-term outcome for this project is a good one. I asked Connor to bring a testimonial to this effect, but I can say from reputation that Sulis has a really great reputation of doing what they say they're going to do. That's backed up by the security that they've agreed to, which I know that other solar developers have not agreed to. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that this project will be decommissioned and the land made re-suitable for farming. Again, unlike the Yamhill Creek project, it's barely visible from the highway. We've only had one person who actually has a view of the project testify today. And for these reasons, it's really hard to imagine if this project doesn't satisfy the board's old conditional use criteria for solar generation facilities. It's really difficult to imagine what would. So with that, I'm going to let Connor address some of the other issues that were raised.
Thanks, Heidi. So just on, I noticed a trend on some of the issues that I'm talking about here, and that is that we do have conditions that we need to satisfy prior to construction of the project. If it was, successful in this process, we couldn't start building next week. We do have a number of things that we need to satisfy, and I think that they actually do protect a lot of the points that I'm about to bring up. So I'll go through each one of them and then refer to the conditions that we have to adhere to. So the first is glare. We've heard before that the principle of solar panels is that they need to take the light in rather than reflect them. So that's what they're supposed to do, and that's what they do. That's how they work. At some incidence levels from the sun, they can reflect, and we've seen pictures that I'm not going to refute here. What I would say, though, is that when they do reflect, it's no more than a body of water. It is only at certain times of the year. And bring it back to my original point, we do have a condition that requires us to purchase panels that have anti-reflective coating on them, which does provide a lot more protection from glare. I'm not sure if that was a condition for the Mill Creek solar project, and again, as a general trend, a lot of these issues that were concerns that were, perhaps rightly brought up by some of the neighbours of that project, we had nothing to do with that, and I think the concerns that were brought up have actually been kind of fed back into the conditions that the planners have recently been putting into their reports. One example of that is that we need to do a stormwater report prior to construction. So that's I think a big comfort in relation to the gentleman's concerns earlier with regards to soil runoff and stormwater. We need to go through an extensive process with the DEQ prior to construction. That is a condition that we need to do. That analyzes and our construction and installation processes will be reviewed throughout that process, and we will not be able to build without approval from the DEQ because the planners have noted that there is a wetland on site and the topography could needs specific attention. So I won't refer to the so we did do a stormwater report, which we haven't done previously on site. So we did do the soil erosion and compaction plans. But I would like to give, the gentleman who's speaking earlier, protection or kind of comfort that there is protection over the potential soil erosion and runoff through that DEQ process. So a few people referred to kind of returning the farmland to the quality it's in now, and it's quite easy to ask the question: have you seen it been done before? It's easy to ask that question and make it seem as if the lack of answer because of there not being a history is a negative aspect to it. These solar facilities are 25 plus years old, and that's why we haven't seen it in practice. What we do know is that science can tell us what's going to happen here. The main components that are penetrative to the topsoil are there's two things. There's the aluminum posts and there's the concrete slabs for the electrical equipment. Concrete, everybody knows about. It's sand and stone and water, so nothing to worry about there. Aluminum is widely used as a building and construction material, and it is there's kind of two reasons why this is the case. One is because it's lightweight and easy to manufacture, and the second is that it isn't corrosive, and that's what would a corrosive material would contaminate the soil, and that's just not the case here. Like solar farm owners and developers, we wouldn't want a corrosive material in there, no matter what it's going to do to the soil. If the subsoil racking is being affected negatively and threatening the structural capability of the solar panels, that would be a very bad thing. So we want to install the very best and appropriate materials as well. The manufacturing standard of these racking piles is they are hot dipped in zinc, which is another, along with aluminum, is another naturally occurring material. It's present in all soils and groundwater and pretty much everywhere. So I would I'd reinforce the argument that the materials that we're using here aren't, nuclear. It isn't difficult to argue the science behind the lack of possibility of soil contamination onto the farmland. So, I'm with that said, and I'll just conclude on that. I think or conclude on that specific point. The farmland will be returned to the quality with which we are seeing it now prior to installation. Sorry. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's two sort of PGE related issues. One was whether or not the renewable electricity is required. I referred earlier to the renewable portfolio standards, and it was argued that perhaps that's not the case. I am very closely associated with this being the case. The Oregon Public Utility Commission do review each year the amount of renewables that PGE have installed and have in the pipeline, and do require and tell them what prices that they do need to pay to incentivize new generation coming online. That is a fact. It happens on the 1st of May every year, and we follow it very closely, because should the pipeline and current installation rate be of such quality that PG can demonstrate that they have achieved their standards, not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 35 years, the Public Utility Commission will tell them that they don't need to incentivize new generation. At the moment, that's not the case. So just with regards to local electricity usage, one of the things that we need to do as part of our studies with PGE is that they do review local consumption. If the local consumption is too low for our generation to come online, we need to pay for something that's called a transfer trip. That means that it's taken, so if there's an over generation on that specific circuit, it is able to trip onto either different circuits or go onto the high voltage electricity lines at the local substation. That isn't the case here. The local consumption has been reviewed by PGE. We are how they classify that as something called a daytime minimum load, which as the name suggests, it's the lowest load and consumption that they have ever seen on the line, and this project is below that value. So that should give people plenty of comfort that the electricity will be used locally. Yeah, I might just ask Les to come up and just conclude our rebuttal.
Just a couple of small things. As was mentioned, we do mechanically harvest our cherries, and that was the reference that was made there. As far as soil compaction, once you put an orchard in, you drive over it every year. You drive over it with your sprayers, you drive over it with your tractors, you drive over it with your harvesters. So there's some compaction involved. It's the same with a vineyard, unless you go through in subsoil. With our situation, we do have irrigation. So we do irrigate, we irrigate vineyards to start them up. We've even irrigated a vineyard in the middle of 2 years ago because it was under such stress, and the people involved there were able to produce a crop. So irrigation is a factor that we do, and it's a little different from the things on the hill. As far as the visual impact, we had a neighbor who was a developer who developed homes. At a certain point in time, about 10 or 12 years ago, we harvested some timber up in that area. She built 3 homes very rapidly there. I fear for those folks that as our timber grows again, those views are going to be impacted substantially, as are most of the people above us, because we own up to the hill and the timber there is growing fairly rapidly. So some of the views that are suggested are going to go away in the near future. Other than that, again, it's uncomfortable for me to have neighbors who are concerned, and we'll do everything we can in the event that the project goes through to allay those fears and put pressure on Connor and his group to give us the results that we have that are more compatible with our neighborhood.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Grogan. All righty. So at this point, we'll have a staff recommendation if there are no other comments. Ms. Armstrong?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Sadler?
I'm sorry. You were correct.
Okay.
Staff is very aware of the concern regarding the cumulative impacts of solar facilities. However, the board has since amended the county ordinances to restrict solar facilities to those sites that are non-high value farmland. Therefore, planning staff has reviewed this application against the applicable state and county criteria in effect at the time the application was made, which does allow commercial solar facilities on high value farmland as a conditional use. Additionally, ORS 215-296 does not require demonstration that a proposed conditional use on an EFU zone parcel will not prevent future agricultural use of the soils occupied by the non-farm conditional use. because ORS 215 authorizes in EFU zones several uses that involve removal or loss of agricultural soil, such a requirement would effectively prohibit uses allowed in EFU zones under the ORS Chapter 215 standard. And as previously noted, the location of this proposed facility is well suited as it is barely visible from the highway. So staff believes this application meets the applicable criteria, and therefore we recommend approval of the application with those 18 conditions listed in the July 27th decision letter.
Thank you, Ms. Armstrong. So at this time, with the consent of the commissioners, I'll close the hearing, and we can begin deliberations. Okay.
That's a good place to start deliberating.
All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break. It's 12:35, and we will reconvene, actually begin the proceedings again at 12:40.
Short one, huh?
Short and sweet.
Short.
Good idea.
Sweet.
Also take- reconvene, and we are at the point of deliberation. So, Commissioners, does somebody have a motion? We can make a motion, and then we can discuss. We can go from there.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to be consistent with my previous application. I'm going to make a motion prior to discussion and that we deny the application.
Okay.
And I will go on to do that when we get to discussion.
Okay, we have a motion to deny the application and to uphold the appeal. Any further discussion?
Just a couple discussion points, maybe before we take the vote for it to the discussion. This is one I really struggle with, but as we've gone through a couple of these now, I look at this as that, to me, we've talked a lot about the wine industry and vineyards and grape growing, and there's a lot of other counties that have the same issue, and they don't grow the same kind of crops. So to me, this isn't an issue whether it's with the wine industry, whether it's with, it's a farm use, high-value farm use issue. I respect the fact when we talk about visibility and the visual appeal and the access and the glare, but to me, those aren't the key issues. The key issues to me are, what about runoff? What about soil compaction? What about the loss of quality topsoil? Those are the real issues. It's not the crops that are growing it. I think sometimes we try to kid ourselves by saying this is a solar farm or alternate energy source, when this is really, when I look at it, this is no more than an industrial use in a rural zone, and I don't care for that. I think Commissioner Primus had said early on, let those power companies such as PG, if they're really interested in doing this, let them build infrastructure to support it. The fact is most of our substations and transmission lines are located along major highways. That's why they want to site it in high-value farm land. So therefore, in looking at past experience, I just would have trouble actually approving the application.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Primizic?
Yes, we've had, as you know, these do not come before us unless they're appealed, and there have been solar farms structured throughout the county. The ones that have come to us, the one that was approved, that I sat here and listened to testimony and was reluctant but agreed to the approval, was the Mill Creek site, and almost all of the promises made by the vendor concerning the structure, the implementation, were not met. When you look at what they did during the course of construction, and the glare that was mentioned here earlier, all of those things did not follow what we were told was going to happen. The case of the one on Yamhill, I was very disturbed to have to say no, but I do not believe that the solar farms are consistent with the valley and what we've had here forever, and what I hope to see long after I'm gone in this valley is a representation of agriculture, and I do not consider solar panels part of our agriculture. I don't see them as farms. And that's my personal take on it. I've known Mr. Stevenson for many years. Mr. Dromgold, who was at the Yamhill site, I serve on a board with him. But I have to take that out of my thought processes as I look at this and think of the future of Yamhill County, and I certainly do not want to see all of our farms dotted with these solar panels. So I just, to be consistent with my previous statements concerning this, that's why I made the motion I did.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think it's important to note, as been stated here before, that this board is not bound by past policy decisions that were based on individual applications. As we've heard in this application, it is barely visible, and my question is, where were all the other neighbors if this is going to have such an impact? Farmland is beautiful. I live on farmland, but farmland doesn't pay the bills unless you can generate income from your property. We heard here that our, quote, most precious resource is grapes in this county, and I disagree. I think our most precious resource is to honor our private property rights. And the rights of the private property owner is to be able to use his property that as he sees fit, that is consistent with, and in this particular case, as this application is, consistent with the goals and policies of the state comprehensive plan and the county zoning ordinance. I think it's important to acknowledge that we are, in this particular case, penalizing a man because he happens to own and has been in his family for over 150 years, high-value farmland. So if throughout the years we've seen crops change and we've seen the whole economy change based on what people are growing, and we've seen it, and we've seen that it is economically viable to, in one instance, grow cherries, and when the age of production catches up to an orchard, then you have to move on to the next economically viable crop. Apparently there were no takers when it came to planting grapes. The next option is to plant timber, and then in 50 years when you harvest it, for those who have not lived on property where you've had a logging operation, I can tell you, you want to talk about impact to the soil, and you want to talk about impact to views. This is logging equipment, and trucks will have an impact that you can't believe. And so there seems to be not too much concern when small woodland owners are involved in logging operations, but we're concerned about the impact to the soil when we have a solar array. Our job here, I believe, is to support farmers in agriculture as we have, and in efforts to maintain their farms and to plan for the future. In a former application that Commissioner Primizic alluded to, there was a farmer who simply could not get anyone to plant anything on his land and asked for a way to have an income, and that was going to be able to keep the farm and his family. That, unfortunately, I believe, was denied. So once again, we were all cheering when we heard that the state was going to require renewable energy. We thought that was great, but everybody is saying not here. We can't use that power here. Well, we certainly can't drink all of the wine that we produce here, yet it does have an economic benefit to those who produce that wine. I think that as this is an income source for farmers, it provides renewable energy. It's consistent with Yamhill County and State Comprehensive Plan. I think the tax revenue to the county is something we need to consider, but by and large, what this comes down to is enabling a man whose own property to use 8 acres of his land to generate enough income to be able to help him perhaps grow something else at some point in time. And so for that reason, I think we should uphold this application, and so I will vote in opposition to my fellow commissioners. So at this time, I will call for the vote, and all those in favor of denying the application signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. Aye. The motion passes. So,
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
I will have findings prepared by October 4th, if that's acceptable to you.
yeah, so at this time, and then we'll vote on adopting those findings on October 4th. Okay. So at that time, we will reconvene the formal session, and at the point of announcements, any announcements?
No announcements.
Hearing none, we will adjourn today's meeting. Thank you all for being here.